Okay, guys, we'll kick it off for the next one. We have Troy Hunt with the responsibility of disclosure, playing nice and staying out of prison. If you can give a warm welcome.
Thanks, guys. AusCERT actually asked me if I'd come and do a talk around disclosure, and I think it's kind of an interesting topic, both from an individual perspective, so for those of us trying to disclose vulnerabilities, and also an organisational perspective, so those receiving reports. So I thought I'll do this talk around playing nice and keeping yourself out of prison as well, which is also kind of nice. And we'll talk a little bit about responsibility and disclosure. Out of curiosity, has anyone here tried doing responsible disclosure before? How'd it work out for you? Why don't you put your hands down? Has anyone been on the receiving side, like getting information from people who found holes in your things? Well, okay, Bug Crowd guy has, yes, I know that. We'll get back to you. All right, so this is something that happens a lot. People find holes in things, they find data exposed, and they want to try and report it, and it doesn't always go that well. And what I want to do in this talk is show you what it's like for those of us trying to report things responsibly, how we do that, both bad and do it well, and also how organisations are responding to it. And I want to try and leave you with stuff that hopefully you can go away, whether you're an individual or an organisation, and do better. And I thought where we might start is I'll pick an example of where it kind of goes wrong, and we'll have a look at what went wrong and how it gets received. So there's a case here that Darren Pauly wrote up last year. And you look at this headline and you go, researcher arrested, reporting coinage hole. Doesn't sound very fair, you know, not real fair on the researcher. But it's interesting when you start to unravel what happened and you look at why we have problems like this. So this bloke is Dave Levin, and he works at Vanguard Cybersecurity in the US. And he's sitting here in this video we're about to see with this other bloke, Dan Sinclair. Now, Dan is running for the supervisor of elections in Lee County Council in Florida. So immediately there's a political angle. And as soon as it gets political, things go a little bit crazy. Now, what seems to have transpired is Dan's running for this spot, and allegedly it has been in Dan's best interest to show that the incumbent elections committee folks haven't been doing a very good job. So with Dave's help, they've managed to go and find pretty serious vulnerabilities in the elections website. Now, this is just the website of the elections. This is not like the voting machines. But what they've decided to do is they said, well, we'll go and make a video and we'll record just how bad it is. So let's have a look at what Dave's talking about here.
The first things I'm doing, I'm looking for a vulnerability, a page that is using search query language, something that you might see on a day-to-day basis. And I'm looking for an injection point.
Now, there are multiple worrying things here other than search query language. Structured query language. Structured, Dave. What he's doing here is he's got a tool called Havage. And Havage is a very Mickey Mouse kind of SQL injection tool. It's an offensive tool. And you can see up there, and there's a little URL there in the target. And what Dave has done is he has pointed this offensive tool at an elections website and said, go and try and break into it. Go and try and get the data out. And right about here, you're going, Dave, this probably isn't going to work well for you, mate. Keeping in mind it is videoed and then it's put on YouTube. Any of you can go and find this on YouTube. This is not exactly like Secret Squirrel stuff. So anyway, Dave's running the tool and he's pointed Havage at the website. Havage has come back and it's done what Havage does, which is get a lot of data out of the database. And we can see here it's sucked out usernames. He's obfuscated a bit of stuff here. There's some first names, last names, passwords, all sorts of stuff. And we'll have a look at what Dave does with this next.
Right to the admin login page, and the first attempt with these supervisors' login credentials was successful.
And you're looking at this and you're going, Dave, why? Internet Explorer of all... No, it's not that. Why? Sorry, Microsoft. Why would you take data out of the system? Like, he's already in trouble, right? He's pointed Havage at the system, he's got data out. And then he's gone, let's just see if it works. And videoed it, and put it on YouTube. And sometime shortly after this, Dave got arrested. And Dave ended up spending, I think, about 20 days in prison, couple of years, sort of suspended sentence, probation, all that kind of stuff. The sort of stuff you don't really want to have on your record, particularly when you're working in the security industry. So juxtapose that with the headline, right? The headline, security researcher arrested after finding a hole. It's often a little bit different to that. So for those of you finding vulnerabilities like this, you've got to sort of keep in mind, how far do you go? Like, where is the point where you go, this is probably far enough? And I'll give you a really good tip. You'll remember this after I show you this. What you do is you apply the Sinead O'Connor test. So what that means is, let's say there's a page, a search box, right? You go to the search box, you reckon there's a SQL injection risk, you go to the search box, you search for Sinead O'Connor. And if the page comes back and does this, this is where you stop. Because as soon as that apostrophe in the nice Irish name causes this internal SQL exception, and you see this message which says there's probably going to be a SQL injection risk, you don't have to go and pull all the data out. Because right at this point, you have demonstrated that there's a vulnerability. Now, a lot of people then say, well, I didn't think they'd take me seriously unless I pulled all the data out. But it's also nice not to be arrested. And when you get to that point, things change. And I'll give you a really good example of why that happens. I get a lot of people send me emails because they find holes in things, they find data. I run this Have I Been Pwned service where I aggregate large data breaches and I make them searchable so you can figure out where you've been exposed. So people pop up and they find this info. And I had a bloke email me the other day, and this is exactly what he sent to me in the first email. And I thought, okay, that's cool. You know, you want to support people, getting into IT, a bit of web dev, a bit of security, very good. And within this message, this first message, he went on and he said, I was browsing around the web and I found some stuff. And you look at this and he's found names, birth dates, email addresses, like sensitive stuff. And I wrote back to him and I said, well, that's probably not meant to be there. You should get in touch with them and disclose it responsibly, disclose it privately. Send them an email, communicate off the public timeline. So I sent him that message back and he reverted a couple of days later. And he started like this. And I thought, this isn't going to be good, is it? And he went on, he said, well, I grabbed 10,000 records out of the system. Now, this is really problematic because let's say you grabbed one record out of the system. If you grab one record, think about it from the company's perspective. Company goes, all right, it's not good, we've got a hole, someone unauthorised has grabbed a record. We're going to have to let that person know that their data got taken by someone else. Once you grab 10,000 records, and now it's incumbent upon the company to let 10,000 people know that their data got taken out of the system, regardless of how stupid the company was and how bad the developers were and how much they screwed stuff up, they've now got an obligation to take actions which may not work out too well for this guy. Now, he only had to give them one other person's record. Think about the design of the system. It's not like there's a requirement here that you log on, and it's okay if one other person loses their data, but not if 10,000. As soon as there's one, that is enough to sort of tick that box that goes something's wrong. And the thing is that we see people get themselves into a heap of trouble for stuff just like this. So I'll give you an example. A few years ago, we had this headline. A little bit similar to the first headline we saw, security researcher found guilty, a hackless hack, which is an interesting choice of words. And the guy here in the corner is Andrew Auernheimer. And some people might know Andrew Auernheimer. He's also known online as Weave. And Weave has got a bit of a history of making bad life choices. And some of us would argue his judgment isn't always real good. What Weave had done is he found a vulnerability with the registration of iPads against AT&T's service, which was a direct object reference risk. So it was literally like there is an identifier which is passed in a request. If I change that identifier to something else, like I change the number, I get back someone else's data. And at some point, Weave has gone, I wonder if this was an accident. So he did it another 114,000 times, just to make sure. And then he sent the data to Gawker, and then he got arrested, and it was all very unpleasant for him. And again, like the situation here is, how far do you go with this, right? So I'll give you another way of thinking about this. So think about it with these guys. Anyone know who these guys are? No one should remember. This is a very good answer. It is 90s Christian rock boy band +1. Now, some of you see the relevance here. If you have a number in a URL and you +1 and you get someone else's data back, don't +2 or 3 or like all the way up to 114,000. As soon as you gain unauthorized access to someone else's data, that is a problem, that is a vulnerability. And as much as I appreciate how the organisation would take this a lot more seriously if you handed them 114,000 records, again, it may not end up real well for you. And just one unauthorised record is really enough to demonstrate the point. So for those of us reporting stuff, we've got to think, where is that line? And look, I get it, because for a lot of these folks, often they're a lot younger, they're maybe not as worldly, maybe haven't sort of thought through the consequences, and they're sitting at home in the comfort of sometimes their bedroom, because there's often kids, at their own PC, and they're just adding numbers. How does it matter? But then we end up with headlines like we've just seen. So for individuals finding stuff, that's really important. Think about it on the other side. So think about it in terms of the companies being notified about incidents, because this is what often happens next, all right? Someone's found something, they want to let the company know. And I'll give you a few examples of how this can play out. So there's one here, the company which is Pay As You Gym. And these guys are over in the UK, and it's one of these things where you just pay every time you go to the gym. It's not one of these things where they lock you in for ages. They have a big sort of social media presence. They've got a lot of stuff online, a lot of membership stuff online. And a little while back, this bloke popped up. And he's got this message, right? We have access to your server. Incidentally, when you see folks like this say we, it's usually the royal we. It is someone sitting there who's gained access. It sounds much more impressive if it's we. So anyway, we've gained access. Please contact me, this is interesting, me, via DM. Ignoring us is not a solution. And then we've got evidence, right? So we've got a proof of some level of access to the system. Now, I guess the first thing here is like putting yourself in this person's shoes, probably not the most friendly way to approach a company. You know, we've got access to your data, send us a DM. But consequently, the company ignored them. And I actually got in touch with this person and said, look, you know, this looks kind of real. Has Pay As You Gym actually made contact with you? No, hadn't made any contact. So they followed up. They, he, she, whoever it was, followed up and said, hey, look, you know, got in there, we're going to put the data up for sale. Now also, this is not really a good way of endearing yourself to the company involved. But the thing that struck me is that the company was just not responding in any way. So this individual could not get any response whatsoever from the organisation. People are tweeting the organisation going, for God's sake, just pay attention to this. Because maybe some degree of interaction is going to help you minimise the damage or reduce the amount of data that's been spilled. Maybe it's going to help you fix the underlying flaw that's been exploited to get the data out. The company just totally ignored the individual. And of course, eventually, exactly what was prophesied in the tweets happened. Data dumped everywhere. And there was a lot of information spread out there via the usual sort of pastebin channels. All the data's out there. One of the interesting things, actually, as this data got spread around, is Pay As You Gym didn't even really understand what was in there. So they sent notifications to everyone impacted and did the normal, you know, tweet, we're really sorry, we take security seriously stuff. And they said, don't worry, your credit cards weren't in there. And a bunch of people looking at it going, here they are, I can see it, it's in the data. And it's documented evidence everywhere. And they went on for days and days going, no credit cards involved. Because the company wouldn't even make contact with the individual and understand the scope of the risk. And when I see this, look, I can understand it may not be nice to get in contact with someone who's effectively trying to extort you. But just ignoring it often has really unpleasant consequences. I'll give you another example, and this is a much more recent one, and it shows a real sort of interesting series of failures. And it's to do with these little guys. Has anyone got one of these? No, of course you don't, because you're all sensible. This is a message you can hug. Now, here's how it works. So these are teddy bears that are filled with little electronics, like a little Bluetooth device, a little microphone, a little speaker, a little flashing LED you can see on the front of them, a little button inside the paw, and they're called cloud pets. And here's the idea with cloud pets, right? So you've got mum, dad, and you've got a kid. And maybe mum works late a lot, and mum would really like to talk to the kid. So what happens is mum pulls out the smartphone, records a message into the Cloud Pets app, goes up into the magic of the cloud, and then comes back down to dad's phone. Dad's within Bluetooth range, goes to the Cloud Pet, the light on the Cloud Pet flashes, and the kid knows they got a message from mum. Which is cool. Like, you can see how your normal everyday people would go, well, this is really nice. We should put this in our child's bed. Because then the child is there in bed with the listening device, it is a listening device, recording messages back into the little unicorn, sending it back up to the cloud, and it goes the other way. And, you know, look, those of us in this room have got a bit of an idea about the sorts of stuff that can go wrong with IoT. And inevitably, something did go kind of wrong. And there was a company called Context Security over in the UK. A bloke called Paul Stone found that there was absolutely zero auth in order to connect to the device over Bluetooth. And he said, look, so long as you can see the pet, and when I say see, be within range of the pet, you can take control of, in this case, the unicorn. So he wrangled up this little web Bluetooth implementation. And what he's done here is he's gone, I'm going to create a message and I'm going to push it to this device and I'm going to play it to the child with the device. He's blinking the light, push the message out. There's a little kid in their bedroom with the unicorn right now.
Exterminate, annihilate, destroy.
Now imagine, I got a little girl, right? I got a little 4-year-old girl. This is the sort of thing she'd look at and she'd love. Imagine she's sitting there in bed and there's some weirdo out on the street doing Dalek noises to a cloud. I've got to explain that to her. Well, you know, this is the way the internet works, dear. So this is not good. You don't want your cloud pet to do this. So Paul got in touch with them and he said, look, I think your unicorn's got a problem. You know, there's no auth, we can do all this stuff. He did this in October last year. Reached out to Cloud Pets, didn't hear anything back from them, couldn't get an answer from them. And then a few months went by and a couple of other people found some interesting things. And what they actually found was that there was a MongoDB sitting up there in the cloud that had no auth, and it was publicly facing. So remember, like late last year, early this year, there was a lot of Mongos exposed. A lot of Mongos sitting out there on the web, people using Shodan, finding them, going, oh, there's no password on this Mongo, and they get access to all your data. So two separate people tried to get in touch with them. So one of them was in late December, and then the same person tried again in early January, and then someone else came along and tried as well. Could not get any answer. And they were literally looking at this. So this is their exposed MongoDB. Was exposed. It's not now, but we'll get back to that. So sitting out there on the web, and this is the sort of thing that a company really, really, really wants to know about, right? If you've got your entire customer database sitting out there. Now, interestingly with this as well, in this MongoDB, you'll see we've sort of highlighted a user table here, a bunch of user info. The actual voice recordings of the Cloud Pets weren't in there. So when your unicorn talks to you, it's not playing it out of the MongoDB, it's getting it out of S3 storage, but the MongoDB has got the entire URL of the S3 storage path, and there is no auth on the S3 storage. So if you know this obfuscated URL, which is all stored in Mongo, it's game over. And I say that because afterwards, Cloud Pets came out and went, no voice recordings were harmed in the disclosure of this database because they weren't even in this database. But all the URLs were there. You know, it's like, where are you going with this? Anyway, so a couple of people found this, which wasn't good. And then it got kind of worse because the database got wiped. And this is what was happening with exposed Mongo. People were going, there's an exposed MongoDB here. Why don't I wipe all the data and I'll leave a ransom message and I'll say, if you pay me Bitcoin, I'll give you your data back. Doesn't happen because it doesn't really make sense to download all the data and save it and then load. This is not like ransomware where it's just like there's a private key that's got to be given over. And the reason it was ransomed 3 times is because people were going, there's an exposed Mongo, let's wipe it and put a ransom there with my Bitcoin address. And someone else would come along and go, oh, it's still exposed. I might change that Bitcoin address to my own, right? And we know from the Shodan history that there were 3 separate instances of ransom messages being left on the same database. And still, Cloud Pets wouldn't get back to anyone. Eventually, they obviously figured out something was wrong because all of their pets would have kind of died because there was no data left. So they must have figured it out and they restored it. They got it back up, and in Feb, someone sent me this data for the Have I Been Pwned system, and I got in touch with a reporter that I've worked with before. Reporters are very good, usually, at getting answers from companies. It's one of the reasons I use them a lot when people send me data. And the reporters are trying to get in touch with Cloud Pets. Cloud Pets still isn't responding. They still can't get an answer from them. And they're trying to reach out to this bloke here. So this is Mark Myers, and he's the CEO of Spiral Toys, and Spiral Toys makes Cloud Pets. And eventually, one of the journalists, after this is like all over the press and it's, you know, terrible news, eventually one of the journalists gets in touch with Mark. And we worked out why he wasn't responding to anyone. Because here's what he said. And you're looking at this and you're going, but Mark, it's random people who find your broken shit and try and report it to you. Like, this is the entire definition of people finding vulnerabilities in your system. It is random people who are out there. Like, they are the people that you really want to take seriously and you really want to listen to. But they had obviously decided just to ignore it, even while the database was public and while the unicorn was talking like a Dalek. It was random people, so they ignored it. It didn't work out real well for Cloud Pets. A lot of them sort of ended up there on the shelves. In case you don't recognise the store, this tweet probably puts it in context. It's kind of sad, isn't it? You know, all these little teddy bears and unicorns, no one wants them. They've been anonymised by having a label over what they are. So look, they were sort of on a downward spiral before the actual breach incident and the data being exposed and the Dalek stuff. But I thought that was just a really good example of how bad communication can be. And for those of you thinking, why don't people who find vulnerabilities report it more frequently or report it more freely? It's because of dealing with stuff like this. It is so painful so often to try and do the right thing. It's not always that way though. Sometimes it works very, very differently. Was anyone here in the Red Cross Blood Bank data breach last year? Me? A few other people. So let me talk about this, and I think this is probably why AusCERT wanted me to do this talk as well, because they were quite involved in this. And I'll sort of walk you through what happened with Red Cross, the way it kind of unfolded, and then some of the things I think we can take away from this. So going back to later last year, someone reached out to me and sent me a message like this. We know he's a hacker, he's got a hoodie. Incidentally, that's not this individual's real avatar. I never sort of share who it is and who's talking, and fortunately I've actually never been asked. So that's good news. But anyway, he pops up and he says, look, I've got this website. And this is someone who had been reliable in the past at sending data that was accurate. And it was particularly interesting to me because this person is overseas. I'm quite sure they're not in Australia. But this is in my backyard, right? This is .com.au. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. I would like to know more about this. And he followed up and said, look, there's a lot of Aussies in there, 1.3 million Aussies. And we later learned that it was 1.3 million records, about 550,000 Aussies. But I'll come back to that. It's still a lot of data, right? And he says, all right, so this is what I've found. And this is all the messages precisely as sent. I haven't edited any of this. So this is the sort of stuff that you would expect to find in a registration form to donate blood. And there's a lot of generic stuff in there, but we've also got stuff like blood type. And blood type starts to become pretty personal data. And to be completely honest, like, I don't know why I feel this way, because I don't know exactly what you're going to do with my blood type, but it's just a piece of sensitive personal information that I would particularly prefer not to be shared with other people. And he says, look, there's no passwords, So maybe it's not really of any relevance to me and what I do with Have I Been Pwned. But I was still very interested in it because this is a major thing if this is Red Cross Blood Bank. So I went back to him and I said, look, I would actually be interested in that. I've donated before, so maybe I'm even in there. And then he very kindly sent me my data. And when he did that, to be honest, I wasn't completely happy about it. And it was my date. The only thing I've redacted there is obviously my birth date, but that was actually, everything else there was legitimate. And that was the date that I had last given blood. And all of that information was accurate. Not a lot about me. My wife was in there as well. Her data was accurate. Her blood type was in there as well. For some reason, my blood type wasn't. And by the way, this is the appropriate response whenever you're in a data breach too. So he then went on and said, look, I was just scanning IPs. That's how I found it. And we chatted a little bit. And what it turns out he's been doing is he goes, this is how high tech this is. Let's just go through the IPv4 address range. We'll make HTTP requests to port 80. We'll see if any of those return a directory listing. We'll see if the directory listing includes a .SQL file. And what he had found was backups of the Red Cross Blood Bank data sitting there on a publicly facing server on an IP address. Backups of the database. This is not some high-tech, sophisticated exploit, zero-day, funky, crazy stuff. This is, you put your backups on your web server. This is what it was. Anyway, he went on and he said, I'm not a bad person. And to be honest, I believe him. He didn't show any signs of malice, didn't want money, anything like that. We went through a clean-up process later on and he made lots of commitments, which is exactly the sort of thing we'd like him to make. Just want to show people how bad it is. And he gave me the URL, and you can see there, 5th of September 2016, Australian Red Cross Blood Service. So obviously this was pretty bad stuff. And it was legitimate data. And having seen what you've just seen with the other examples like Cloud Pets and things like that, I'm sitting there going, well, what am I going to do? Because I don't know anyone at the Red Cross Blood Bank. I don't know if they're going to take this seriously. I don't know if they're going to do Cloud Pets and just go, you're a random person, go away. So I thought, all right, look, I don't have enough confidence to submit it to them. And then I thought, well, I could go to the AFP. I know some people there. I could let them know. But they're actually trying to prevent stuff like terrorism and really important stuff. Are they really going to want to prioritise this? And so then I went, well, I know some people from AusCERT, so I'll reach out to AusCERT. And I got in touch with a contact there. And it turned out that the Australian Red Cross was had an AusCERT membership, so they had all the services and things they offer. And that suddenly changed the way this whole process went from here. So I want to sort of walk you through some of the things I did. There are a bunch of stuff that happened that went really, really well in this disclosure compared to some of the other ones you just saw. So a really good example is I spoke to the person at AusCERT in the afternoon. It was like a Tuesday afternoon. And first thing the next morning, this person was on a plane from Brisbane down to Melbourne. I could just imagine them sort of all mobilising quickly. Had someone on the plane down to Melbourne, literally sitting with the Red Cross to help them sort it out. So they were going to deal with it really quickly. Obviously, one of the first things they did as well is got that data removed, locked down that server. And incidentally, that data, it wasn't the Red Cross's server, it was an outsourcing provider. The Red Cross didn't lose the data. Their outsourcing provider, a company called Precedent in WA, lost the data. Well, actually, they didn't lose it because now really there are more backups than ever. But they made it publicly available. All right, so it worked really quickly, which was good. The next thing that happened is the Red Cross got their disclosure out, I think from memory, within 72 hours. It was like Tuesday afternoon we found it. I think it was Friday morning, about Friday midday, they disclosed it publicly. So their communication was also very quick, and it went out via email, via SMS, via press release. And I'll show you the CEO in just a moment as well. So it was there in every channel you could imagine. They communicated very, very quickly. And via ways that everyone that was impacted was going to know about it. They're also very honest and direct about it. And you'll often see, when you look at data breach notifications from companies that have had incidents where they've lost huge amounts of information, and you look at the way things are worded, and it's like, Yeah, I remember the Ashley Madison one. They go, don't worry, your credit card's all right. And I go, hang on a second. You've just disclosed the fact that 30 plus million people are having an affair. This is their sexual orientation, the kind of women they like, but they don't have to replace their credit card. Good news. This is crazy. So I think the honesty of the way they handled this was really good. And they made it very, very clear that this is what happened, we screwed up. And really, it's the vendor that screwed up, but they took responsibility for it, and I'll show you that in a moment. So this is important, and look, let's face it, honesty is not hard. Honesty goes out the window when you get PR people involved and legal people involved. Curious sort of anecdote here, the same person who found this also found tens of gigabytes worth of Michael Page data only a few weeks later. This also was a big story, not as big in Australia, it was a big thing in the UK. Michael Page data, and they found a similar situation where the outsourcing partner of Michael Page, who's Capgemini, who incidentally has revenue of €11 billion a year and hires 180,000 people, but it didn't stop one of them taking production database backups and putting them on a test web server, publicly facing. Found all there. They took something like 7 or 8 days to disclose it. I had emails, but I had mental images of a lot of people in suits sitting around trying to figure out how they were going to spin this to minimise damage. It's not what happened here. They're very honest. Now, here's the other thing, and this may not sound like a major thing, right, an apology. But have a listen to the apology that Shelley Park, the CEO of the Blood Bank, put out. And just have a listen to the words she uses and how people will feel when hearing that.
We apologise and we take full responsibility for this. We apologise to our donors and we acknowledge that this is unacceptable. Our apology is unreserved. We are incredibly disappointed.
And I think this is really important because often this is lacking. In Cloud Pets, I was watching for this. Are they ever going to just say, we're sorry, we screwed up? Because you think about it, those of you with kids, right? When your kid does something wrong, you go, mate, the first thing you've got to do is you've got to say you're sorry. It's not hard. We teach our children. Organisations should be able to do this as well. And this sort of transparency and honesty, I think, went a long way. Shelley called me up a few days after this whole thing settled down as well and was genuinely thankful that I had reported this. It wasn't like, oh man, I wish we didn't have to deal with that. It was like, thank you for finding this and help us put a lid on it. So let's sort of start looking at how we're going to make this easier for everyone. So for organisations and then for those of us finding risks. And I was going to start with these guys. This is very timely because we've got Casey here. So bug bounties. I love the idea of formalising the structure by which people can report bad things when they find them. Now, bounties are nice because they can make money out of it, and that gives incentive to report ethically as opposed to go and do other nefarious things that could earn money with it. But even when we look at what we can do, short of paying people money, things like simple vulnerability disclosure policies. So I'll give you an example of this. Tesla's got a really nice one. When you go to Tesla's legal page, they've got information about their vulnerability reporting policy. This is text on a page. It's not hard to do. And they say stuff like, you guys are important to us. We would like you to disclose responsibly. If you find stuff, here's how to get in touch with us. Very hard even to do this quite often, just to find an email address and send a message. And not only send a message, but then actually be able to do it in a secure fashion too. Because you're probably going to find stuff that really should be protected in the way you submit it. And then you're submitting stuff and you've sent it off into this mailbox, into the internet somewhere, and you don't know if they're dealing with it. So they come back and go, well, here's how quickly we'll get back to you. It's pretty easy. Here's what you should and shouldn't do. Because as we've seen, there are certain things that really aren't cool if you do find a vulnerability somewhere. And then finally, if you play nice, we won't throw the book at you. Which again sounds pretty reasonable, right? Go and have a look at their legal page. If you don't have any sort of public statement about how you would like people to submit vulnerabilities to you, just have a look at the legal page, because this is not hard. Now, the interesting thing is that when you look at the different organisations that either run bug bounties or they have sort of vulnerability reporting policies or some other variation of that, basically communicating how they would like people to handle these sorts of things, a lot of what you see is really reasonable. And I'll give you some examples. Salesforce. Don't attempt to access data that doesn't belong to you. Now, maybe you do that once because that's the nature of finding vulnerabilities. But you don't go and then do a weave and go, well, here's 114,000 records. Right? You don't need to do that. The other one I quite like is Seek. So Seek says, don't try and exploit it further. Like, please don't make it worse. And you look at that and you go, yeah, that's quite reasonable. I can get on board with that. Please don't degrade our service. You'll usually see clauses around finding vulnerabilities is cool, but please don't DDoS us, because DDoSing causes us problems. It's quite reasonable. Bosch has one. Also quite reasonable. Let us fix it before you tell people about it. Now, there's a different discussion to be had here around how long is long enough, what's a reasonable time frame, but the premise of it would be nice if we could fix the vulnerability before you tell people about it seems pretty cool. And my favourite one of all is Cloudflare, where they say, please don't attack our employees. So in case you've been watching this and you're going, I know what I'm going to do, I'm going to get a baseball bat, and I'm going to go and wait by HQ. When the CEO comes out, I'm going to bash him until he gives me his password, and then I'll just log in. Don't do that either. So look, I want to wrap it up there, but I've tried to leave a couple of minutes in case anyone's got any questions about this. Right down the front's easy.
Hey, so I actually was on a phone call this morning working with responsible disclosure with an organization, and they're trying to push back very hard on the disclosure timeline. We're doing the industry standard 90 days and even giving a little bit of leeway there, and they're asking until Q1 2018. And then they go into this conversation about how they're trying to uphold kind of the security of the internet backbone, because it's like an ISP that we're dealing with, and then putting it back on us that we are then being irresponsible by sticking to that 90 days. So what are your thoughts on 90 days? Should there be leeway there? You know, that kind of seems to be one of the big areas of contention within this process of how long is reasonable.
Yeah, and it's really hard. I came to the talk earlier on about our mandatory disclosure laws, which was very interesting, but there were a lot of lawyer words in there around things like reasonable. And this is the thing, right? Because it has such an interpretive meaning. And without knowing what the vulnerability is, like 90 days seems like a hell of a long time for a lot of stuff. If your database is publicly facing, asking for 90 days, not so good. If it is something which is a fundamental core component and requires some real sophisticated attack in order to break it, and then it has major ramifications, and they don't think anyone else is going to find it, like I can see them arguing that. But look, I don't think there's one easy answer, you know, like there's so many variables in it. But I can see how companies are trying to argue, and I think what makes us all a little bit uncomfortable is when we feel that an organisation isn't taking this seriously and they're not applying urgency. And I think if I felt that in the discussion and I went, these guys are really trying to deal with this efficiently and quickly, I'd be much more understanding. Any more? One more? Sammy?
What's your blood type?
Yeah, you know, I honestly don't know, and the record was null. I know what my wife's is, I'm not telling you that, but it was null. So I still am none the wiser to my blood type. You know what I do know though, is that after this, one of the things I was really worried about with Red Cross, one of the first things I thought about is, if this is in the news and everyone sees Red Cross vulnerability, is it going to make donations go down? And it's like this moral dilemma, because I don't want that to happen, because that's actually got like life-threatening consequences. But all our data is out there, so we've got to know about that as well. So afterwards, I went for the first time in several years and donated blood to try and make a point that we should still go and keep doing this. Guys, I think we're out of time, so thank you very much for coming to my talk.